For 18 months, a growing wave of terror swept the city of Boston, Massachusetts. Between June 1962 and January 1964, 30 women, mostly elderly and nearly all living alone, were murdered in their homes. In every case, they were sexually assaulted, sometimes beaten, bitten, or stabbed and strangled, and their near-naked bodies laid out as if for a pornographic photograph. Even when he had strangled them with his bare hands, the killer left his signature of an item of their clothing, such as their stockings or pantyhose, tied as a neat bow beneath the victim's chin. The first murder took place on June 14, 1962. That evening, Juris Slezers called for his mother, 55-year-old divorcee Anna Slezers, originally from Latvia, to take her to church. He found her lying naked just outside her bathroom door, her housecoat spread out under her, and the belt knotted tightly round her neck and tied in a bow. There was no sign of a break-in, although the apartment was in a state of disarray, and the police concluded that a robber had been challenged by Mrs. Slezers. Finding her in a state of undress, he had raped her, then strangled her so that he would not be identified. Some 2 weeks later, on June 30th, 68-year-old Nina Nichols called her sister, Mrs. Marguerite Stedman, at 5 p.m. to say that she would be over for dinner in an hour. She cut short the telephone conversation, saying, "Excuse me, there's my buzzer. I'll call you right back." By 7 p.m., the Stedmans were worried that Mrs. Nichols had not arrived and called the janitor of her apartment building. He used his passkey to open her door, but had no need to enter. The apartment had been ransacked, and in front of him on the bedroom floor lay the naked body of Nina Nichols, with a pair of her stockings finished with a characteristic bow knotted fiercely around her neck. This time, the police decided that it was not a case of attempted robbery. Nothing, it appeared, had been taken, and the killer had intended only to make it seem so. It began to appear that a sexual psychopath was on the loose in the city. Only 2 days passed before police received a call that 65-year-old Helen Blake had not been seen since June 30th, and it was feared that her apartment had been burgled. When they arrived, they found Helen lying face down on her bed, naked except for a pajama top. She had been strangled with her stockings, and her brassiere was also knotted around her neck in a bow. After the discovery of Helen Blake's body, the police questioned all known sex offenders and investigated any men, aged 18 to 40, who had been released from a mental institution in the preceding 2 years. They issued an appeal to all women, especially those living alone, to keep their apartments locked, to admit no strangers on any pretext, and to report any suspicious occurrences. They were overwhelmed with the response, but none of their identity parades or lie detector tests of suspects produced a positive result. After 3 weeks, when the Strangler had not struck again, it was hoped that the killings were at an end. Then, on August 21st, the corpse of 75-year-old widow Ida Irga was found in her apartment. She had been dead for 2 days and had been strangled by hand, but a pillowcase in the characteristic bow was round her neck. The body of the next victim was discovered at the end of the month, but 67-year-old Jane Sullivan had then been dead for over a week. Strangled with her own stockings, she had been dragged into the bathroom and dumped half-kneeling in the bathtub, with her face and arms under the water. For a time there were no more killings, but the city remained in panic. The Boston Advertiser published an appeal to the Strangler. "Dawn to kill again. Come to us for help. You are a sick man, you know it." But there was no response, and the killer's choice of victim changed dramatically. On December 5, 1962, he murdered 20-year-old Sophie Clark, an attractive black student whose body, sexually assaulted and strangled, was discovered by one of the two friends with whom she shared an apartment. And on New Year's Eve, Patricia Bissett, 23 years old and white, was left on her bed, strangled and assaulted, but covered with a blanket. On May 8, 1963, 23-year-old Beverly Sammons became the 8th victim. She was found by her fiancé, spread-eagled and naked. Around the time that the third murder of an elderly on a sofa bed in the living room woman occurred, the state authorities requested her wrists bound behind her back panel of psychiatrists to assess the cases. Their majority, with silk scarves and a bloody opinion, was that two separate persons, both stalking and two handkerchiefs unmarried, were responsible. One a school teacher and tied at her neck. She had not been the other, a man living alone. Both were filled with strangled, however, but stabbed 22 hatred of their mothers, who were probably deceased. Times in her throat and left breast. The panel suggested that during the childhood of the Strangler, then reverted to killers, their mothers had walked about half exposed in their apartment, but punished them severely for type when he next struck. Any curiosity. As a result, the Stranglers acted out. Neighbor discovered 58-year-old that repressed emotions in adulthood, killing elderly divorcee Evelyn Corbin, her body, women in a way that was both loving and sadistic. Exposed in the typical Strangler, and both, the panel concluded, had a weak and pose. She had again been strangled, probably absent father, and grossly sexually violated. The police remained as frustrated as one member of the panel disagreed. He was psychiatrist Dr. James A. Brussel, who had scored a famous success ever in none of the cases had, in his psychological analysis of the mad bomber of anyone been seen entering a New York, George Metesky, in 1957. Following the victim's premises, and there were final murder, but before the perpetrator had been no physical clues. Apprehended, he published his Psycho Fit of the Boston. Then more young women became Strangler. The crimes were committed by only one man, his victims. On November 23rd, he said, a well-built 30-year-old of average height, 1963, he killed 23-year-old Joanne, clean-shaven and dark-haired, probably of Spanish or Graf, leaving her naked on a day Italian heritage. This description closely fits DeSalvo, bed with her own black leotard. In some desperation, the police had also consulted the knotted around her neck and his Dutch psychic detective, Peter Herkos. He described bite marks on her breasts and on lightly built man weighing 130 to 140 pounds, with a January 4th, 1964, two girls who, pointed nose and a scar on his left arm, and he loves, shared an apartment with 19-year shoes. Remarkably, such a man was on the suspects. Old Mary Sullivan returned from List, a mentally unstable salesman of women's shoes, worked to find her brutally murdered. She was discovered propped up against the headboard of her bed, with her knees up, violated with a broom handle. A stocking and a silk scarf were tied together in a large floppy bow, and a greeting card reading, "Happy New Year," was laid against her left foot. The continuing failure of the police to apprehend the Strangler and the intense public outrage prompted the Attorney General of the Commonwealth to take charge of the investigation and set up a task force, who worked throughout 1964, tirelessly sifting through reports. They examined dozens of suspects, weirdos of all kinds, and the usual number of oddballs who arrived to confess to the crimes. But all were released, and for 10 months the cessation of Strangler killings suggested that he might have left the area, perhaps committed suicide, or, sated, had just given up. Then, on the morning of October 27th, everything changed. A young wife called the police to report a sexual attack in her apartment. She had seen her schoolteacher husband off to work and was dozing in bed when a man appeared at the bedroom door. He was around 30 years old, medium build, wearing green pants and large sunglasses. He told her that he was a detective, then lunged forward and held a knife at her throat, saying, "Not a sound or I'll kill you." He gagged her with her underwear and tied her wrists and ankles to the 4 bedposts, after which he began to kiss and fondle her. Suddenly he stopped, saying that he was sorry, and fled. After giving details to detectives, the young woman worked with a police artist to put together a likeness of her attacker. A detective took one glance at it and concluded, "That looks like the measuring man." Albert DeSalvo, a handyman aged 33 with a police record, was picked up at once. He denied his involvement, but his victim identified him immediately. Between 1958 and 1960, police had handled many reports of the activities of one who had been nicknamed Measuring Man. He had gained the name because, armed with a clipboard and tape measure, he would call unattractive young women, representing himself as an agent of a modeling agency, telling them that they had been selected as possible models for TV commercials. He would then proceed to take their vital measurements. He did not attempt rape, but succeeded in seducing many of them, and sometimes, he later claimed, it was he who had been seduced. In March 1960, Albert DeSalvo was arrested following a break-in and admitted he was the Measuring Man. He was convicted of breaking and entering and indecent assault and sentenced to 2 years. He was released on parole after 10 months. But he now became more aggressive, breaking into apartments, tying up and raping his victims. After his arrest for the last sexual assault, the police teletyped his picture to neighboring states. They were amazed at the response. Reports came in from New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut that DeSalvo had been identified as the Green Man, responsible for assaults on hundreds of women. His nickname came from his habit of wearing a green work shirt and pants. It was estimated that over the past 2 years, he had committed more than 300 sexual assaults. He himself later bragged that he had raped 6 women in a single morning and put his score at over 1,000. DeSalvo was committed to Boston State Hospital for psychiatric observation and was found to be overtly schizophrenic and potentially suicidal. He was therefore sent to the mental institution at Bridgewater, Massachusetts, on the 4th of February, 1965, and ordered to be detained indeterminately. The police had not yet identified DeSalvo as the Strangler. Indeed, by rights, He should have been picked up in the dragnet instituted nearly 3 years earlier, but he had been listed on the computer for his breaking and entering crimes and not as a sexual offender. Then came a breakthrough. In Bridgewater, DeSalvo talked constantly to another inmate, George Nassar, about sex and violence and hinted that he was the Boston Strangler. There was a $100,000 reward for anyone who provided information, leading to the apprehension and conviction of the Strangler. So Nassar told his attorney, young F. Lee Bailey, later to become famous in many prominent cases, about the conversations. Bailey interviewed DeSalvo several times in the institution, tape recording what he had to say. DeSalvo claimed that he was indeed the Strangler and divulged details of the murders that had not been made public and that only the killer could have known. He also claimed 2 further killings, which, because they had not shown any of the Strangler's characteristic touches, had not been considered related. Bailey turned over copies of his tapes to the Attorney General's office and the police. When questioned, DeSalvo sketched plans of the different apartments in which the murders had taken place, and under hypnosis described the stranglings in horrific detail. Assistant Attorney General John Bottomley spent a long time in many interviews with DeSalvo and was convinced that he was the Strangler, but the suspect was known as an inveterate bragger, and there was no corroborating evidence. However, there were many fat files on his other crimes, and on June 30th, 1966, a hearing began to consider DeSalvo's fitness to stand trial. The judge accepted the prosecution's argument that he was competent, and the following year he was found guilty of armed robbery, breaking and entering, theft, assault, and sexual crimes on 4 women who were fortunate enough to have survived and were willing to identify their attacker. He was convicted and committed to life imprisonment. Nevertheless, he was never convicted as the Boston Strangler, and he did not live out his prison sentence. On November 26, 1973, he was found stabbed to death in his cell in Walpole State Prison. There are aspects to the Boston Strangler case that make DeSalvo's guilt not as clear-cut as has been made out. At the time, there was at least 1 murder every day in the city, and the remarkable difference of 4 young victims killed between December 1962 and November 1963 at least suggests the possibility that a copycat murderer was at work. It has also been claimed that DeSalvo's confession was, at least in part, fabricated by investigators. The nephew of 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, convinced that DeSalvo was not the killer of his aunt, reported that he had personally confronted the man responsible. The man had been on the list of suspects, but further investigation was dropped following DeSalvo's full confession. In December 2001, Miss Sullivan's body was exhumed for forensic tests by a team of scientists at George Washington University. DNA analysis of stains from her underwear matched neither her DNA nor that of DeSalvo. Said Professor James Starrs, who headed the team, the evidence that has been found is quite clearly indicative of the fact that Albert DeSalvo was not the rape murderer of Mary Sullivan. However, Frederick Bieber, associate professor of pathology at Harvard Medical School, retorted, "Finding someone's DNA at a crime scene doesn't tell you how it got there and when. Similarly, not finding someone's DNA at a crime scene doesn't mean they weren't there. Who can say?"